That's the important part of this event. My name is Patricia Gainza. I'm from Espacios Sin Fronteras. That means Space Without Borders from South America. And I'll do my best to help to talk. I'll tell you what will be the methodology for these 2 hours of dialogue. The first hour, we will make a little speech from the speakers. And after that, we will make another hour to talk to you, where you will be able to ask about the things that we will development. This first plenary is called Crisis, Critique and Consequences of Global Migration, Resistance, Organization and Action. The idea for this first plenary is an introductory plenary that will critique the current issues, trends and modalities related to migration by linking migration to social issues. This panel will seek to challenge this perspective while proposing possible action for addressing the problems that exist as a result of our current understanding of migration. We were talking a lot between us and with the organization committee, and we thought that it's a very good idea to explain main ideas from the speakers about, first of all, the situation, the context of each continent about migrations and human rights migration, link to crisis and the economical model and other issues that will be chosen by speakers. And in the second time, we will talk about key points to a common action platform, because that's the main idea of this 5th World Social Forum on Migration. So, we will start to talk. First will be Leopoldo Peco's speech. Leopoldo is from Trade Collective South Africa. Peco serves as Executive Director at a progressive research and advocacy think tank called the Trade Collective. The organization explores the political economy, international trade, migration, and broad construction of citizenship. Their work is infused with race, gender, and class analysis. She is an active member of the Pan-Africa Forum for Migration and Development and has attended various global forums on migration and development. So, Peco, thank you again, all of us for being here. And Peco has 5 minutes to talk about her ideas and Africa context. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, Patricia, and all the co-panelists. Good morning to everybody here. I bring you lots of warm greetings from Africa. I'd like to talk about, exactly as Patricia has mentioned, really some of the challenges of what migration present to us, not only in the African context, but in the global context. The truth is that everybody is moving. Most of us are products of movement. I am a product of movement. My father was not born in the country where I now reside. I was not born in the country where I now reside. My siblings and I were born in 3 different countries. So migration and the notion of movement and citizenship and belonging become very real issues to most of us in this movement. I'd like to talk a bit about some of the aspects of, number 1, feminization of migration, and secondly, some of the policy constructs that shape where our migration policy is taking us right now. It's been very much impacted by labor markets. Labor and capital go hand in hand, and migration is obviously a consequence and an output of the confluence between the two. Now, the demand for skilled and semi-skilled workers is extremely high in the global north, as we're aware, and it feeds what we call the underground economy, or the so-called informal sector, which is really precarious, really pernicious, and is a thing that actually is the bolster for most GDPs. Now, in all of this, I think it's also very important to ask a few questions. What is the impact of globalization for the nation state? What is then the relationship between globalization, migration, and inequality? How should we redesign our policy frameworks to enable the state and people to benefit from their own movements? And what kind of state capacities are needed to respond to the challenges of globalization, to respond to the challenges of migration, and to respond to the different forms of movement of people, both documented and undocumented, skilled, semi-skilled, or highly professionalized? And I think that these are really crucial questions which we need to try and address as a collective. I think as well, when we speak about the notions of citizenship, this also brings us to a discourse on entitlements, belonging, rights, and responsibilities. We also need to think in the modern state about whether the construct of what statehood now means have actually been encompassed by what migration has become. Now, when we speak about people having a sense of belonging and understanding that most of us live and reside and work in the countries outside our forebearers, what then does that mean in terms of our definitions of what a nation is, our definition of what migration means, our definition for what belonging and citizenship should now mean? And I suppose a lot of us are exploring the notion of not only transnational identities, but translocational identities. Now, all of this is extremely useful to capital. Capital has no particular interest in whether I was born in South Africa, whether I was born in Zambia, whether I was born on the moon, in fact. It really doesn't matter. What matters to capital and what matters is whether it is able to extract as much labor for as little as possible. Whether I'm able to move from one place to the other is then my competitive advantage. But the competitive advantage of the migration discourse has not really been tapped into, because it is so much linked to what states feel is a protectionist agenda of keeping people out, rather than understanding that there's a far greater common citizenship of workers of solidarity, documented or undocumented. Now, two significant parts of this are: number one, the relocation of manufacturing to countries where it is deemed to be far cheaper to produce, as well as the growing amount of international tourism driven by the recent economic meltdown. So everybody is looking to get as much for as little as possible. The other thing as well, I think that's quite important, is that when we speak about migration, particularly within the African context, that there is a huge amount of internal migration that is taking place. South Africa is a very key anchor country, anchor state within the continent. But there are so many others as well. In East Africa, for example, that would be Kenya, which has then become an anchor for Ethiopia, for Sudan, for Somalia, recently, about 15 years ago, for Rwanda, and a generation before that for Uganda in the 1970s, for example. In West Africa, that would certainly be Nigeria and Ghana would be two pivotal anchor states. And I think that it's very critical when we think about this to also understand that the bulk of migration within the African continent is exactly that, within the African continent. And the percentages of people who are trying to get to Europe and get to the United States are significant, but are lesser than the numbers who are actually moving internally. So internally, we have been struggling quite a bit with the notion of what a borderless Africa looks like. What it looks like conceptually, what it looks like politically, what it looks like economically, what it looks like financially as well. And our various regional economic commissions such as the SADC, such as ECOWAS, which is the West African Regional Economic Commission, Southern Africa, East Africa, and COMESA as well. We've been grappling with the fact that we want to talk the rhetoric of borderlessness as a concept, but very few of us are willing to cede the national territorial borders to make this actually happen. Now, in so doing, one also has to understand that the double bazooka of economic globalization, it has seen the development of unprecedented interconnection between, number one, immigration, and number two, increased trade capacity, and number three, the neoclassical, neoliberal models of competitiveness and employment policy. However, what we see is that most nations do not necessarily factor in the notion of cheap or undocumented labor as a very important buttress and contribution to this economic model. In fact, instead, they are illegalized and illegitimized. And one of the things, for example, in the Southern African context, is that undocumented labor, and these are very, what's the word? These are very speculative figures, but we believe that it amounts to about 17 billion US dollars, which is not insignificant, and that it may contribute to almost up to 30% of GDP. Again, not insignificant, but again, wildly speculative due to the precarious nature of it. I guess in my last 1 minute or possibly 45 seconds, I think I would like us to then draw on possibly comparisons and think about linkages between the various regional experiences which my learned comrades and compatriots are going to talk about. I think that it would be very interesting to also think about how we are then able to draw from current best practices. I'm also very concerned about the notion of building a global citizenship which transcends the concept of time and space, which is able to speak to a sense of belonging, a sense of citizenship, which is linked and located to solidarity, which is linked and located to our collective contributions to the global economy, which is linked and located within the ability to then build a critical mass of policy advocacy and to shift the periphery straight to the center. Because the truth is that most of us, even though we may be deemed to be these shadowy twilight people who don't belong quite anywhere, we are actually the anchor of the global economy, we're actually the anchor of migration, and we're actually the anchor of the universe, as far as I'm concerned. We are holding up the sky through our labor, and I hope that we'll be able to explore this much more. I thank you. Gracias. Merci.
Thank you. It's not easy to be pushing people for time, short, but I think we work together. Well, next speech is Angela Zambrano from National Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean Communities, NALAC. Angela was elected president of NALAC in 2005, a position she currently holds. From 1995 to 2007, Angela was executive director of the Central American Resource Center in Los Angeles. And she is a member of the board of the Angeles Coalition for Human Rights and Immigrants, and member of the board of Wsfm, New York. Okay. Well, I give you.
Thank you. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Well, I first want to thank the organizers for this wonderful forum. I also want to thank the Miriam Kalish and Cherito for the support that they're giving us to have this this event that I think is obviously already very successful, and I want to thank all of you for making the time, the energy, and the sacrifice to be here to this extraordinary 5th World Social Forum on Migration. Over the past 3 decades, a series of profound changes have taken place in the degree of economic, social, political, and economic interdependence among nations. The process called globalization, which Walden Bell talked about earlier very eloquently, has linked in perhaps irreversible ways the future of all people in the planet we share. In the Americas, the connections reach deep into our economic, social, political, environmental, and cultural fabric. However, the policy response from governments across the region has not reflected the richness of our interconnection. Trade agreements have opened up the flow of goods and capital across the region, but have left enormous gaps in terms of harmonizing other critical areas of human interaction, such as the flow of human beings across borders, the appropriate protection of human rights, access to medical care, access to political representation, labor standards, and the management of shared environmental risks such as the climate change and the over-exploitation of natural resources. From the point of view of organized migrant communities residing in the United States, the nature of the relationship between the United States and our countries of origin present both an opportunity and a challenge. US-based communities recognize the transnational nature of this challenge. However, the current punitive and unhealthy policy regime around migration, both in the United States and Mexico, with respect to its neighbors from the South, creates a barrier to taking advantage of the transnational perspective to a just and sustainable development. Migrants in the United States are working to change the punitive paradigm that exists around migration policies in the United States and the world. Hopefully that's one of the goals that we come out of the forum, is to change the paradigm that makes immigrants, that sees immigrants and migrants as a threat, as criminals. And as long as we have the policies that are put forward by governments that sees us, migrants, as threat and criminals, we cannot expect a policy that is basically recognizes us as contributors to the economic, social, and political well-being of those countries. So we're policies that would come out that sees us as threat and as criminals will basically start there, as criminalizing us. And in the United States, we've seen that. Under President Obama, for example, we have, there's a policy called Secure Communities that basically, once a person is arrested, the fingerprints are checked with other federal agencies, and if there's a sense by the local police or they think that this person may be undocumented, it is put on hold and then is given to to ICE. And if the person is undocumented, the next thing we know, this person is deported. So that's how we have arrived at almost 1.5 million people deported, and this year alone, almost 400,000 people have been deported. The other is that the states, because the federal government has failed to pass federal legislation, the states have passed laws that are punitive, like the Arizona law, for example, and several other states have also adopted punitive legislation against immigrants. And we will see this happening unless we change the paradigm that, again, sees us as threat and criminals. So hopefully we will come up with some policies that would change this paradigm. And I tell you one thing for sure, that if the immigrants all over the world, do not take this as a test, no one is going to change it. So we have to change the way we are seen and the way we are treated in all of the countries. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Angela. The next speaker is Raul. Raul is an academic and activist, president of the International Network on Migration and Development, UNESCO Chair on Migration, Development and Human Rights, professor of development study at the University of Zacatecas in Mexico. Thank you, welcome. Oh, you have a microphone. Let's go.
Well, I don't know. Oh, yes, it works. Well, thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you very much to the organizers of the forum. I believe this forum is going to be a turning point in the dynamics of the World Social Forum on Migration. I have great expectations that we can come up with a common strategy, action platform for social transformation. One of the main features of the current global architecture, exacerbated in the context of the profound ongoing multidimensional crisis, is the assault on the labor and living conditions of the majority of the working class. In the realm of a worldwide trend towards extreme segmentation and precarization of labor markets, migrant workforce stands among the most vulnerable segments of the global working class. For my position and statement, I will briefly address 4 critical pillars of what may be framed as the migration and labor question today. First, the relaunching of imperialism in the search of cheap and flexible labor, as well as natural resources from the global south. In the neoliberal era, the capitalist world system revolves around the monopolization of finance, production, services, and trade. Monopoly capital has become more than ever the central player. This trend is associated with a new nomadism in the restructuring process of the large transnational corporations, characterized by the creation of what I call the global networks of monopoly capital. With this term, global networks of monopoly capital, I refer to the reorganization strategy of the large transnational corporations who, through outsourcing operations and subcontracting chains, extend parts of their productive commercial and services processes to the global south in search of abundant and cheap labor as well as natural resources. This strategy entails the establishment of export platforms that operate as enclaves in the peripheral countries. 66 million workers from the south are recruited under tough conditions in this sort of export platforms today. A similar trend is being followed by the restructuring of innovation systems through the implementation of mechanisms such as outsourcing, including offshore outsourcing in the scientific and technological sphere, the unleashing of financialization processes and the intensification of environmental degradation are also important aspects of what I should stress is an unsustainable strategy of imperialist domination whose ultimate landmark is the outbreak of the current profound multidimensional financial overproduction, environmental and social global crisis that undermines the main sources of wealth creation, labor and nature, to the point that it can be categorized as a civilization crisis. Second, one of the main engines of the neoliberal globalization is the lowering of labor costs by any and all means, taking advantage of the massive oversupply of labor worldwide. With the dismantling of the former Soviet Union, the ascent of China and India in the world economy, and the freeing of labor through the implementation of structural adjustment programs, as Walden Bayo just mentioned, the supply of labor for capital more than doubled, from 1.5 to 3.3 billion. This has led to a disproportionate growth of the global reserve army of labor, which absorbs nearly 60% of the global workforce. The outrageous dimensions of surplus population is interrelated to the abysmally low wages and chronic insufficiency of decent employment that characterizes contemporary capitalism. According to ILO figures, 1.5 billion workers are subject to vulnerable conditions. 900 million receives a salary of $2 or less. 204 million are unemployed. This in turn has led to a growing pressure to emigrate internally and internationally under conditions of extreme vulnerability. Third, a main consequence of the capital restructuring process under neoliberal globalization has been the mushrooming of unequal development at a global scale. This has propelled growing asymmetries among and within countries and regions, together with the increase and intensification of social inequalities. In fostering this tendency, the implementation of neoliberal structural adjustment programs has played a fundamental role. Through disarticulating the productive apparatus in the periphery and its rearticulation to the core economies under sharp asymmetric and subordinated conditions, these programs allow the earning of enormous monopolistic returns or imperial re-entrants by taking advantage of both the existence of subsistence and below subsistence wages in most of the global south, and the generation of abundant mass of dispossessed labor obliged to abandon their places of origin. This global movement, the indirect exportation of labor through outsourcing plants in the global south, and the direct exportation via migration, has shaped a new international division of labor, which encompasses the emergence of new modalities of unequal exchange, much more severe than in the past. The net transfer of revenues through outsourcing operations and the transfer of the social, reproduction, and educational cost of the migrant labor. And my last point, fourth, under these circumstances, large segments of the population in the peripheral areas are literally expelled from their territories. Labor oversupply and worsening living conditions turn contemporary migration into a form of forced displacement. We call it forced migration. Contemporary migration is basically forced migration in all these modalities. Moreover, under neoliberal globalization, people that are forced to move are subject to conditions of high vulnerability, criminalization, social exclusion, precariousness, and extreme exploitation. To conclude, I want to underline that the migration and labor question are two sides of the same coin, whose currency translates into the unbearable conditions of systemic oppression against the working class promoted by neoliberal globalization and its driving forces. It demands, and this is the main point I want to emphasize, the unity of social organization and movements in alliance with progressive intellectuals in order to foster an anti-systemic process of social transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Raul.